Welcome to A Turn for the Better. I'm Dick Singh. Today we're going to do a little craft type project. I think it's kind of unique. How I came about this, I was asked to do demonstrations out at Craft Supply USA in Provo, Utah before the Utah Symposium. And they told me they would like me to do some of their new projects, which one of them happened to be a larger calculator than normal. Most people take a calculator and just embed it in a piece of wood, and it makes it a calculator embedded in a piece of wood. I didn't want to do that. I figured I could do something better, and this is what I came up with. I really didn't want the calculator just to be embedded in a piece of wood and set flat. I was looking for something that would be a little more distinctive, and what I've done is I've embedded it in a piece of wood, but I've put it in at roughly a 10-degree angle. Okay, this makes it where when it sets, you can see it. And again, it's not just put into a piece of wood per se like anyone else would do. I also put in an inlay around it just to add a little bit of pizzazz. Now, one word of warning. This inlay has the appearance that it is not really tight and well fitted, but it happens to be the glue darkened the maple around this piece of carob that is the inlay. So be aware of that when you go to take and make your inlays. Here's a piece of maple with a cherry inlay, and you don't see that at all. Everything fits, looks perfect. Makes a nice little interesting calculator. Here's another piece of myrtle. Again, this one has no inlay on it at all. I think it's probably one of the nicer ones, but one of my problems with it is that it's difficult to pick up with one hand on account of its shape. And yet I think it's one of the best. My wife doesn't think anything of it because her hands are small and she uses two to pick it up. And just to go along, I also have one of the small ones. This one's considerably smaller than the big one, but seeing how they have two different ones, I did have to try and see if they were going to make the same type of calculator, and they do. One of the problems that I had to overcome making this, how do you set this up and cut this 10-degree angle? Okay, it'd be pure dangerous to go to a saw with something like that. I mean, that's a good way of getting yourself in big trouble. You could go to a disc sander, but that's an awful lot of material to remove. 9 times out of 10, if you're going to make one, you're probably going to make more than one, so why not take and do it the easy way? I'm going in and show you how to set up a jig that will make as many as you would like. This calculator happens to be from Craft Supplies USA in Provo, Utah. They have quite an array of stuff. This one happens to be 4 3/8 approximately in diameter. They also have a smaller one, which is considerably smaller, but we're going to work with the large one today. The material I'm going to make this one out of is a piece of myrtle burl, and it's roughly 5 3/4 by a little over 1.5 inches, 1 5/8. Now you have to have enough material here that you can turn it and still maintain your 10 degrees or whatever degree you decide to put on it. I'm also going to take and put in an inlay around it, which I'm going to use a piece of cherry. And the reason I'm going to use the cherry, the contrast between the two is nice, but it's not so startling or severe that it just stands out and slaps you in the face. I would rather have it where you take a look at it and all of a sudden you realize there's another piece of wood circling that calculator. To determine our inlay, again, we want to measure it roughly 4 3/8. I'd like to put a 1/16 around the outside. So I need a 1/16, which means 1/8 of an inch. 4 3/8 plus 1/8 would make it 4 1/2 inches. I have put a little scrap block in and trued it up. And to turn my inlay, I'm going to use a piece of double-faced tape. I have taken my inlay and bumped it on a sander, so I have a flat surface. And that should set us. Now when you do use tape, all double-faced tapes are not made uniform. They're not equal. The carpet tape I wouldn't want to use. If you're going to be doing something on a lathe, get a good brand, something like this is Permacell. Some of your places will sell it. This happens to be 2-inch. You can get it 1-inch rolls, whatever, but buy a reputable type of double-faced tape. I'm going to take a 3/8 spindle gouge and just turn the diameter on my inlay. Let's check it and see where we're at. Just a little heavy yet. Now there's something that you probably won't be thinking about, but you should. You want these walls to be parallel or vertical. You don't want them tapered. If you look at your vernier calipers at the legs, they should not have a gap. They should be in unison. Okay, mine right now has a slight taper, a little less here than it is here. So I'll take that into consideration as I turn this. Okay, that's straightened up the walls. We're pretty uniform. And I'm within about 5 thousandths, which I think is quite fine. Now that I have it made, I'm going to remove it from my scrap block. A lot of folks have a hard time getting double-faced tape to come apart. As you noticed, I didn't really jam on it, fight it. I just applied pressure and held it, and it came right apart. I'm going to use the screw in my chuck to hold my calculator block. Now, sometimes the screw is too long for what purpose you want to use it for, so I use a little spacer that I made out of a piece of Baltic plywood. All that does is reduce the length of the screw so I hold less and don't damage the piece. Now, if your turning abilities won't allow you to do this safely, use a small faceplate. Use whatever means you need to accomplish it safely. Now I'm going to turn the diameter and clean it up a little bit just so I can see what I really have. The side facing the chuck will be the top of our calculator. So I need to clean this up as a means of holding it to turn it around. I've just cleaned up the bottom, and what I'm going to do now is make an expanding mode recess for my chuck. Just getting rid of some of the material. I'll take a little scraper and make my dovetail. Okay, I've put my workpiece back in my chuck using the expansion mode, and I'm going to clean up the surface lightly so I can take and inlay my piece of cherry. Might as well put a line on there so we know roughly where we're at. Okay, if I take that line, that will give me a little extra to play with to put the inlay in. I think most people would grab their parting tool. Now the depth that we're going to have to go in is roughly 3/8 of an inch or whatever you have. But if I use this to bore, I'm going to start hitting on my top, which is going to start flaring my hole open. So instead of using a parting tool, I use a little 1/4 inch square nose scraper, which I have relieved so that doesn't hit the sides at all, and relieve the front just to give me an easy point to sharpen. Check it occasionally. It's much easier taking off a little more wood than trying to put some back on. Okay, we're almost at the end of our cut. I'm going to raise this up just a little bit. And the reason being, as you can see, I'm above center line, which is really a no-no on a scraper. But in this situation, I'm going to be cutting on that wall, and even at center line, I'm liable to hit the edge of the tool. So in being a little above it, I should have a nice clean cut, which I'll be cutting right on that very tip. And another thing, don't forget to line up your tool with the bed of the lathe so that you progress in straight. Okay, we're just about there. Now, this bottom I want to clean up. And instead of using that little one, I'm going to use a larger scraper. This is what I normally use on the inside of boxes. In other words, it's 90 degree roughly, not quite, it's a little less. And it allows me to go in there. I go down towards that wall without interfering with it and come across to the bottom and clean that up. Not bad. A lot of times you end up with a place you're trying to check for flatness where a scale won't go in. A little piece of Formica, one of the samples that you find at your Handy Andy or wherever. Okay, I'm going to take my finished board now. Finish out that corner with this tool. And we should be pretty close to having everything the way we need it. Okay, I'm going to glue in my insert now. I've got the medium glue, and all I'm going to do is go around my edge. I don't need it in the center because we're going to cut that out anyway. Okay, as you can tell by the sound, it's down. Now I'm going to take the thin glue and I'm going to run around the outside or the joint line, and that will run down in and glue anything that the thick stuff did not get. And the reason I do that, I'm going to be cutting that down to roughly a 1/16 of an inch, and I want that glued to the piece because it's not going to have a lot of strength if I don't. I'm going to take a little thin parting tool. Anyone will do. I just find this one works good for me. And I'm going in and leave sufficient material, but I'm just going in and cut out the center. Going to need a little more. I've widened the hole just a little bit. Okay, what has happened is the glue has got back underneath that, so I'm going to have to widen that out. Cleaning that base up just a little bit. Now I'm taking my square nose scraper and going in and reboring this to fit our calculator. I'm sure by the width of that inlay I need a lot more out of there, but again, it's much easier to take and check it than it is trying to put wood back on. Again, I've raised it a little bit so I get a nice shot at that inside of that hole. Now this won't be as critical as it was for putting the inlay in, because we don't want it so tight that if anything shifts that we're going to crack something. I'm going to clean that up a little bit so that I don't have to go quite so deep, make it a little easier on me. Okay, we're almost there. Well, let's give it the final test. Okay, she fits in there, and there's just a slight amount of give, which will allow it to move in case anything ever shifts in the wood. At this point, we're going to start shaping our calculator base. Just using a pulling cut. Be careful you don't take too much off the top, because that has to match up to the calculator. Still a little bit high. Okay, she's still just a tad high. Okay, I think right now all I need to do is break that inside edge and everything will match up about perfect. Every once in a while you come upon a design opportunity, such as this bark inclusion that's having some of the pieces come through it. Now, I don't know how this will work out as we get down to it, but I'm going to attempt to save some of it. So Just as a precaution, I'm going to take the thin super glue and wet that area down. In case anything there is loose, it will adhere it. Again, using the polyethylene to take and spread the glue. Just going to use a shear cut right now just to clean that up nicely. Not really wanting to take a lot of material right now. I'm pretty good in my shape. Remember, I wanted to break the inside of that lightly. Just making sure that that surface is all nice and cleaned up here. You heard that tool jump just a little bit there. There's something there that it doesn't like. This particular piece right here, I'm sure the way I'm looking at it will be gone. That is the opposite side of this, which I want this to be the high side, this to be the low side, and that will be gone. Just starting to sand it out now, starting with some 240. I've worked through 240, 320, 400, and this is 600. My personal opinion is you cannot get all the concentric rings out of anything with the lathe running. So my last sand is always with the lathe stopped by hand. I'm going to give it a coat of finish now. I'm going to use my old favorite, Def, straight out of the can. Slap it on and let it soak up all it will. And we also want to do the inside. Anytime you do an outside and you have the ability to get it onto the inside or the entire piece, do so. Just makes it a uniform finish and nothing moves near as much as it would if it hadn't been finished. Now that bark area was soaking it up. I'll give it a little more. As you can see, our inlay stands out now, but it doesn't stand out so much that it's real obvious. And we'll just wipe it off. Make sure you do this with a paper towel and not a rag. If you use a rag, it won't tear. A paper towel will. Okay, we're going to remove this. We've got it done. Now we're going to have to make a means of turning off our back. Now we're going to start making a jig to hold our base for our calculator. Now the piece that we need is going to have to fit inside of that recess, so it's going to have to be at least 4.5 inches in diameter, or 4 3/8 rather, which will fit inside of there. And the piece I grabbed is a little over 2 inches thick. Piece of maple, whatever you have, all it needs to do is be a decent scrap block. First thing is going to true it up. And we're going to have to clean off the face. And we'll take a look at what we have. Okay, a little high in the center. Remember, you have to slow down as you get to the center. Surface speed is much less. The face of our jig is now flat, and it needs to be, as it will be the mating surface for the inside of the block that holds the calculator. We are now going to work on our outside diameter. Okay, let's see if it'll fit. It does. Sets flat on there, doesn't rock. We've got everything we need right here. Now there's two things we have to do. Number one, this radius is very sharp, and maybe the inside of your piece isn't. Let's break that edge for two reasons. Number one, we don't want any interference in the corner. And number two, we don't want to be cut by it. And it will cut you. Okay, the other thing we have to do is find the exact center of that and mark it. So what I'm going to do is just bring the tailstock up, let it seek its center. If you noticed, it jumped that way just slightly because the rotation makes it find its center, and we have it. That's going to be to locate it. Okay, that side is done. Okay, I need a piece to recut my block at a 10-degree angle. So rather than having something round, I made a square block, went to my bandsaw, cut a 10-degree angle on it, went to my disc sander, and flattened it. Now I have a square block on a 10-degree angle that I can put in my 4-jaw chuck. Now if you notice, in the very center of this one, I also put a hole. This is going to locate this one concentrically. And to do that, we're going to use a small brad. In the center hole that we just put in there, I'm going to put a little brad in there. Okay, that will be used to help locate it on our other jig and keep it concentric. Now I'm going to put a piece of double-face tape on the other half. Let's take that piece and put the brad inside that other hole. Now that we have it on and our tape is holding good, make sure of it, because this is going to be running off center. I do believe this is one time you do want to bring the tailstock up. Okay, I brought up the tailstock. It's found its center. Apply a little pressure. You don't need a whole lot if you're halfway good with your tools. Might be a good idea to shut the lathe off and find out where you really are. Normally I use my little 3/8. This time I've moved up to a 1/2 inch just on account of its, I'm going to be cutting air part at a time. If you look at the top, or on where you can see on the TV, where my tool is working, you can see the shadow of the piece. And if you notice, the cuts are getting progressively longer, which means it's getting more round. Right there, it should be solid. As you can see how it's progressing, I'm starting to get to the point to where I can make my tenon fit in my chuck, and I can also bring up my tool rest now. Again, rotate it to make sure you're not contacting anything. At this point, I'm starting to clean up what's going to be in my chuck. As you can see, This area is now becoming concentric. You can see the difference in the width of this now, about 10 degrees. Doesn't hurt to take a look and see where you're really at. Yeah, I don't need all this tenon on here, so I'll cut some of it off. I'm going to make my dovetail that'll fit in my jaw. Just going to do it by eye. Time to get rid of that tailstock now. And we should have it ready to put into the chuck. Going to now put our jig back in the chuck, or not back in, I'm putting it in for the first time. And seeing how I'm probably going to use this time and time again, I'm going to mark how it is put into the chuck. In other words, this is number 4 jaw, this is number 1. Anytime I take it out, I can put it back in and it will run as true as it was the first time. There is no sense in being haphazard about this job now. As I said before, I kind of wanted to keep this. So this should be the high side of our angle, which means it has to go on the low side. And it does. In other words, by the time it makes a cut, it will cut here and down here. In other words, it will be in a plane 90 degrees to the axis of the lathe. And at this point, I'm going to use double face tape to hold it on. Okay, I've put some double face tape on, and I know how I want to orientate this. And again, the base of this is now out of plane. I'm going to bring up the tailstock, let it seek its center, and again, watch your shadows. That little piece you saw just fly out, that was part that was intended to be cut off. Remember I said there was a cracked area there that I didn't like. Now it's not there. So you want to be careful of it. Be aware of it, I guess, also. As you can see, everything's coming into plane now. Stop and take a look. I still haven't quite cleaned up in this area, but I have here. So we'll just continue to take off that remainder of that wood. One thing you want to watch when you get to the edge, by throwing this on an angle, you now have created an oval shape. It is not round anymore. So you have to be careful of your edges. Okay, we're not doing too bad. And look, we've managed to maintain that. Time to take our tailstock away. Okay, now it's just a matter of flattening this off. Okay, as we can see, we're high in the center. Using a pulling cut. Okay, it's pretty close to being flat right now. I'm going to use another tool to flatten this out real good. Have my scraper that I'm sure you've seen before, sharpened very sharp, almost like a skew. And reason it's sharpened to double like that is because it would be very weak if I had carried that angle all the way out. So I've just made two angles, but I'm going to drop my tool rest a little bit and put it into a position where it cuts like a normal scraper. In other words, I'm 90 degrees to the surface. Now this isn't meant to take a lot of wood. This is just meant to clean up the surface nice. If you look over here, you can see the shadow of where it's out. And it's running roughly 3/16 out of round. It doesn't take much of an angle to make that cylinder into an oval. Okay, our base is now flat. If you wanted, you could put a little concave in it. Personally, I kind of like it flat. If you make it real flat, it sets on a flat surface and pretty hard to move. Our bottom is sanded out pretty decent. But one spot you're going to have to do by hand is your very edge. In other words, it is not round anymore, or concentric, I should say. So just take and make sure you break that edge. And I think we're ready for some finish. Too bad that bottom has to be against the surface. It's too nice to hide, isn't it? And we'll wipe that excess off, and we're ready to take it off of our jig. Eureka! We have one that's on an angle. Here's our finish calculator. I think it looks kind of decent. If you wanted to, there's nothing that says you can't take and put a couple little feet on it, like the rubber feet. Normally what I do is put maybe a couple little dabs of double-faced tape on the back. You don't need a lot. Everybody that's going to be working it is always pushing down on it rather than pulling it up. We did maintain our bark inclusion with the little bits of the burl coming through it which is kind of unique. And it's all done with just a couple pieces of scrap. If you really stop and think, some of your projects you can really make winners out of just by using your head. Now, one other thing before I sign off. Seeing how this is an out of round piece when you're turning it off center, always make sure you move your tool rest before you start, and roll your lathe to make sure you contact nothing. Nothing wrong with using your tailstock to hold that into place until you're done and got things concentric. A little bit of thought sometimes may save some teeth. I hope you've enjoyed today's issue. And this is Dick Singh saying thank you for woodworking at home.